Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Manitoba Agriculture and Resource Development CropTalk webinar. If you have any questions during this presentation today, please type them into the questions section of the GoToWebinar menu, and we will answer them at the end of the presentations. This webinar is being recorded, and you will receive a link to the recording. Thank you.
Thanks, Laurie. I'd like to welcome everybody to the May 12th edition of CropTalk. And today we are actually have the pleasure of having Timmy and Allison on, and they're our kind of our people that manage and get the weather stations working in the province. And they're going to go through some good information as to how to understand some of the information that these stations are giving us. And I think today we're probably going to focus more on soil moisture, which I guess is on a lot of people's minds right now because of the dry conditions. So it's a good opportunity to see some of the information that is generated from these stations. And then after that, we're going to go into the crop scouting panel, and both Timmy and Allison said that they would be willing to stay on and answer some more questions as we go through the panel as well. So with that, I'm going to just go through a couple slides here to get the things going today, and I always like to put up this slide to show where we are in seeding compared to last year and compared to our 4-year average. And compared to last year, we're pretty much bang on with the amount of acres seeded right now. With that 44%, in some people's mind, it might seem a little bit low, but I think when you look at the majority of, or I shouldn't say the majority, but a large portion of our crop is oil seeds and soybeans, and we're probably half the crop in, which would mean mainly our cereals and peas. So definitely close to where we want to be. We're 51% is our 4-year average, so I think we're pretty much right on par. When talking to producers, everybody kind of thought we got an early start, but I think because of the timing and because of no rainfall, guys have been able to go every day, and I think just slowly picking acres off as we go. A lot of talk lately about, it's too early to sow canola, too early to sow soybeans because I'm scared about spring frost. Thought this information would be good to bring up as to when the areas would normally experience their latest spring frosts. And when you look at the majority of the province, kind of that May 16th and 19th is when we got like a 50% chance of a frost happening. So we're still not out of the woods for the frost, but I think as we get into the end of this week, we're probably going to be in a situation where things are going to be good. And just one last slide before we switch over to Timmy and Allison. This is from Manitoba Crop Insurance, and this shows yield reductions, potential yields. And when we look at the second week of May, right now the only real one we need to worry about if you haven't got your peas in, it would be to really concentrate on getting your peas in the ground, because we're starting to lose the potential of getting the 100% yield. When you look at all the other crops, we're still, the potential for 100% yield is still there. So we don't drop off till probably towards the end of next week. So we're getting into full-born seeding right now, but not a super panic as of yet. So with that, and talking about weather, let's turn it over to Timmy and Allison and get some information regarding our weather stations.
Yeah, thank you, Lino. Laurie, can you see my screen okay?
I can see it, Timmy, but it's small. Can you, yeah, there we go. And then do that display settings swap? You bet. Looks great.
Great, thank you very much. And good morning, everyone. And yeah, great to be here today to present. My name is Timmy, and I'll be co-presenting with Allison. So we would tag team for this presentation. And as Lino mentioned, instead of looking at the entire information from the weather network, I think it would be best to focus on just soil moisture, because that's the questions we've been receiving so much of late. And we can hopefully at a future date look at some other parameters from our weather network. So I'm going to get started, and I'll turn it over to Alison midway into the presentation. So today the focus would be on interpreting soil moisture information. And we produce various maps, and again, many folks are using other sources of information. And how do we really do a good job with interpreting soil moisture information? So that's what we'll be looking at today. I'm going to start by saying, soil looks simple, and but we do know that it's complex. And I'm just putting these screenshots of the Manitoba Agri Maps. And the Agri Maps actually has over 700 soil series described in it. And it's very rare to see a uniform soil. It rarely exists in nature. There's usually a physiochemical or biological differences, and that can impact the way the soil behaves. So if I zoom in into one of these locations and I select a specific quarter section, so in this quarter section, it actually shows that there are 4 different series identified in this one little quarter section. So basically you've got a complex right here that has the Denham-Enkhoff complex, and then it's followed by a complex of poorly drained glaciers, which has 50% Osborne and 50% Atkins. We have another 100% Ridge Nord right here, and right at the top corner here, you've got Canterbury complex. So within just a quarter section, you've got 4 different soil series, and depending on where you're monitoring, soil moisture, it can be completely different. You can have a different picture if you're monitoring right here. And actually, I did overlay the soil textural class on this particular quarter section, and you can actually see right here, it's clay, against Canterbury, and you've got the sandy clay loam right here. You've got, again, another clay, the Osborne complex right here, and then you've got the loam. So within a quarter section, you've got 4 different soil textures. So this does provide, complexity in terms of monitoring soil moisture because of the nature of soil itself. It's very heterogeneous. One of my favorite things to look at when I go to the U of M Ellis building is this, what I call the trophy wall with different soil monoliths at the junior soils lab. And it doesn't only show the difference in soils collected at different locations, but you can actually see the difference from the top to the bottom, just from the surface to the root zone layer, how the soil characteristics differs down the profile. So this does provide, again, some level of complexity in monitoring soil moisture because it isn't uniform throughout the soil profile, as we all know. So what are some of the physical differences that we have in soil? And I would point to, again, the pore geometry. And I won't go into the details of the soil physics, but again, this is something that many of us already know in terms of sandy soils, soils that are coarse textured soils. They have larger particles. So sand are usually about, the 2 millimeter diameter fraction. And between those sand particles, you have large pore spaces. However, the pore spaces are few in numbers compared to clay soils or other finer textured soils. So fine textured soils, they do have very small grains. So to be identified, to be classified as clay, it has to be less than 0.002 millimeters in diameter for the particle to be classified as clay. So because of the small nature of clay, they also have micropores. So those are very small pores. So in terms of the number, clays have a lot of micropores. So in terms of the volume, they do have greater total volume, which also infers greater porosity compared to sand soils. So sandy soils or coarse textured soils, they have less total pore volume, although each of those large pore spaces are large, but the total pore volume is actually quite small. So that's less, so we have less porosity. Now, what does that infer? The implication is that clay, or I would say fine textured soils, the greater the finer the texture, the greater the porosity. So clays would hold more water than sand. And then at saturation, so saturation is when the pore spaces are completely filled with water. When the pore spaces are completely filled with water, clays would hold, I would say maybe about 60% of its total volume as water, and the remaining 40%, I'm sorry, it will hold about 60% as water and the remaining 40% as the soil solid, which are the clay particles. In contrast, the sand would only hold about 30% because, again, of its less porosity. So if water were to saturate the entire pore spaces, it's only going to be about 30% of its volume, and the remaining 70% would be the soil solid. So again, this gives us a distinct nature of how soil behaves if you have, depending on the type of texture that you are working with. Now, let's look at how that impacts the response to precipitation. Now, this is at center dove, and on the left axis right here, it's the volumetric water content, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute. And then on the right hand is the precipitation in millimeters. Right? And this was, again, what happened in the fall of 2019, where we had tons of rain late in the fall or early during the harvest period. And I
Excuse me,
decided to,
Timmy, I'm going to interrupt you just for 1 second. I know that you want to use your highlighting pen and we're not
yeah.
seeing it currently. Do you want to try and bring that up again?
Oh, okay. The pen, can you see it now?
Yes. No, we can't. Can you bring your cursor over to the other screen?
Okay.
I can see your cursor.
Okay. Yeah. Oh, okay. All right.
If you want to even just use that, that works as well.
Can you see the highlights now?
No.
No. Okay.
I can
I'm
see
just
the
gonna use.
cursor.
Okay.
If you
Um.
want to just go down to that circle, to the three dots at the bottom there, or just over to the pen and just use your pen there. Yep.
Okay. Alrighty. Yeah. I'm gonna use the pen
There
right
you
here.
go. Got it
Okay.
now. Yeah,
Okay. Thanks, Laurie.
you're welcome.
Okay. Yeah. So basically, in the fall, we did a ton of rain, fall of 2019. So this was about 50 millimeters of rain in one day. And this was, that's about 2 inches. And you could actually see the response, especially at the surface. So the red line here, or the pitch line here, is the 5 centimeter depth. And it did respond almost right away to the precipitation, and actually all the location responded to the precipitation. And the fall later in the month, we had more precipitation, again almost an inch, and later again about an inch and a half. And you could see that at the end of the season, the moisture content at this location at all depth was actually at over 50% of volume of the entire soil. So this was almost at saturation at that point. And part of the reason is because at this point in time, the crops have been harvested. We don't have actively growing crop that is transpiring water. So we don't have a lot of water being taken, a lot of demand from the soil. Let's take a look at Shiloh. Shiloh is one of the sandy location, and this was in 2020, just last year, August. And the location also received very similar amount of precipitation, just slightly more than 2 inches of precipitation. And right away, you could see the impact at the surface. So at 5 centimeters and 20 centimeters, we did see that increase, even at 50 centimeters as well. However, at the 100-centimeter depth, it barely made any difference. And that's because the location had been quite dry before then, actually approaching only 5% of volumetric water content. Now, this is a sandy location. Even if we were to have 5 inches of rain in one day, which I hope we don't, it's not really good to have as much rain in just a short period of time. But if we were to have 5 or even 10 inches of rain, Shiloh, because of the soil physics and the pore geometry, Shiloh would almost never get beyond the 25 or 30% at the most, because it's a sandy soil and it only has, this much very a very small amount of pore volume, although the pores that are there are actually large in nature. Now, I'll quickly just go over some soil wetness characteristics. So basically, after a heavy rainfall, the soil is saturated, and that means that all the pore spaces are filled with water. However, once the rain stops and water actually drains down the profile, after some days, in some soils, actually in sandy soil, it may be in less than 24 hours. In clay soils, the soil may actually sit at saturation and slowly drip down to field capacity over a couple of days. But after a while, the soil actually gets to what we call field capacity. And field capacity is at that point in which the excess moisture has drained off and the soil is holding on to the maximum amount it can naturally hold on to without any drainage happening. I always, again, use the example of a block of foam. If you were to have a block of foam and you soak it in water, once you lift that foam out from the water, excess water is going to drain off from that foam until a time in which you don't have water draining from the foam anymore. At that point, that field capacity, that means that the foam is holding on to as much water as it can naturally hold by itself against the force of gravity. So that field capacity. The other terminology is the wilting point, permanent wilting point. And at this point, it means that the soil is holding on to the water tenaciously against every force that may want to extract water from it. So again, from field capacity, the plant is still very happy. It's growing very okay, taking the water and transpiring quite okay. However, at some point, if you don't have additional water coming into the profile, the water would actually get to the field capacity. And at field capacity, the soil is holding on tenaciously to the water such that the force of the pull from the plant root isn't as great to extract the water. It's very similar to if, again, the block of foam, I'm holding on to it and I squeeze it as tightly as I can. There's still some water in that block of foam. However, because the force I'm able to exert isn't as great as the force that of attraction between that water and the solid, I'm not able to extract much out of it. If I give that block of foam to someone like, Dwayne The Rock Johnson, who I think is stronger than I am just by a little bit, but at least is stronger than I am, he would be able to squeeze a little bit, few more drops of water out of that foam. And that's because he's able to exert more force than I'm able to. So that doesn't mean that there's no water there. It just means that the water is not available to be squeezed out. So that's permanent wilting point. So the water that is held between the field capacity and the wilting point is what we call the available water holding capacity, which is what is available to plants. That's the happy place that the plant is at, because at saturation, the plant roots are actually almost suffocating. There's too much water. So the best place to be is at the available water holding capacity. Now, there's something that we call the readily available water. So readily available water is when it is just slightly below the field capacity. It's readily available to plants. The plant roots can easily extract it. However, as you approach the permanent wilting point and you get down to areas like this, you actually do get to the, it's not readily available anymore, because at this point, the soil is starting to exert its own pressure and wanting to hold more to the water. And the plant would have to do more, would exert more force to be able to extract that water out. And this chart actually shows what happens again at different soil textures, and it's just something generic, the range of values for different in different soils. So in sand, for instance, the field capacity usually would be around that 12% of volume. However, in clay, it can be, right here it's showing about 36, but I know at Glenlee, at Centerdorf, where we've done some research in the past, the field capacity at that location was close to 45% actually. So again, this just gives a generic information about, the field capacity, the wilting point, and in between is the available water holding capacity. And I decided to put this image from the Nature and Properties of Soil. It's a textbook that, almost every soil scientist would have at some point read. And it's a cross section of a plant root that is surrounded by soil. In this first image, it has adequate moisture and there's very low plant stress. So the plant root is happy. It's, again, have enough moisture as it requires. However, in this second part, when the plant is under severe moisture stress, which could occur sometimes, again, in a dry weather when things are dry, the root actually shrinks, and it occurs mainly in the cortical cells of the root, but then it shrinks and it does not have direct contact with the soil water anymore. And that's also because the soil is holding on tenaciously to the water, and the force that the plant root can exert on it is much lower than the force that the soil solid has on holding onto the water. So that being said, how do we report soil moisture? Now, the generic way and what I've been talking about since I started this presentation has been on something called volumetric water content. So what does that mean? It's the volume occupied by soil water in relation to the total volume of soil. And this is, I'd say, maybe scientifically, that's what is often used. Most, again, soil sensors that you would buy out in the market, the data that is coming from the soil sensors would almost always be volumetric water content. And that is the amount of water that is held by volume in relation to the total volume of soil that is within that sensing volume of the sensor. So basically, the sensor we use within the network is the theta probe, and that's based on research that we conducted through the U of M a few years ago. It was, again, very, very good in terms of pre-calibration and post-calibration compared to many other sensors that we tested at the time, and we published a paper about it as well. But basically, again, this sensor, or regardless, any sensor that you'd purchase in the market would give you the data most times as volumetric water content. And in terms of the units, volumetric water content is based on the meter cube of water per meter cube of soil. Now, this sensing volume, the diameter is usually less than, just slightly more than 2 inches. So it is mainly sensing, just close to 3 inches of soil is what the sensor is sensing. So basically, it's saying that, so if you have a value of 0.29 meter cube per meter cube, what that means is that you have 0.29 meter cube of water in 1 meter cube of soil. Now, because it's in meter cube per meter cube, most times many people prefer to report it as percentage, such that the meter cubes both, kind of disappear. But it can be misleading, because if I write 29% volumetric water content, what does that mean? It simply means that I have 29%, or 29, the fraction is about 29% of water out of 100% of soil. Now that can be confusing a bit, and I want to clear that out, because many times one of the number one question we receive about the data we produce is that your station is showing 29%, but my soil is very wet. So how can 29% be very wet? And 29%, because again, I showed the impact of the soil texture on the pore geometry, 29% in sand is actually almost at saturation, because the sand can only get to, maybe 30% at saturation. So at shallow, I doubt if you would actually ever record up to 29% volumetric water content, because it's really sandy location. However, if you were at Glenlee or at St. Adolphe and you see 29%, that's actually almost close to the permanent wilting point. So it's always good to understand the percentage in context of the type of soil that you are interpreting it with. Now, because that can be, again, different in different location. Now, to add an interesting dynamics to, again, the soil moisture, most times when it rains, we often report rain in form of millimeters or maybe in inches. So to ensure that we can correlate the amount of rain we receive to soil moisture, sometimes we report soil moisture in form of millimeter per meter or millimeter of water per 1.2 meters. And that's basically because, again, 1.2 meters is pretty much the effective root zone, rooting depth for many plants. Some definitely would have a deeper depth than that, deeper root than 1.2, but we often use 1.2 meters as the effective rooting zone for most crops. So sometimes we present the information in terms of millimeters of water per 1.2 meters of soil, or you can also say it in inches per foot. So you can convert the millimeters to inches and provide the information as inches per foot of soil or inches per 4 feet, because 1.2 meters is 4 feet. So you can provide the information as inches per 4 feet of soil. Now, I want to go through an example to kind of at least explain this better. So yesterday I checked the Trian weather station, and the Trian weather station reported 19%, 21, 13, and 14% at the 4 depths that we monitor. Now, if I were to convert this into inches, if I want to know how many inches I have in the entire soil depth, I would have to go through these steps, and I'm just going to walk through it in the next few minutes. So the installation depth is that, again, we have 4 depths, 5, 20, 50, 100 centimeters. Now the range they cover, although the sensor themselves is only installed at those depths, but we expect them to cover these ranges. So the 5 centimeter is actually used to represent soil moisture from 0 to 10 centimeters. The one installed at 20 centimeters covers the 11 to 30 centimeters and all the way down. Now you'd notice that we do have greater coverage at depth, and that's because we don't see a lot of movement in terms of the moisture dynamics. It doesn't change as much. And if you go back to the earlier chart that I showed for Centerdorf or for Shiloh, you'd actually see that at deeper depth, you don't have those wavy, response to environmental forcing such as evaporation at depth. So that's why we only have, again, one sensor at 50 to represent this range and one sensor at 100 to represent the 71 to 120 centimeter depth. Now the depth coverage essentially is this covers 10 centimeters, 20, 40, and 50 centimeters to cover the entire 0 to 120 centimeter depth. Now, this was the data yesterday at the location at Trian. So 19% in terms of the volumetric water content, it means it has 0.19 meter cube of water in 1 meter cube of soil. And then again, 21%, 13, and 14, that's what we have right here. So the coverage depth in millimeters, it's simply, I am converting this coverage depth that I have at 10, converting the centimeters to millimeters. So multiplying this through by 10 would give you 100, 200, 400, and 500 millimeters. So this, again, 120 centimeter gives you 1200 millimeters. So in calculating the amount of water in millimeter per coverage depth, it's simply multiplying the volumetric water content by the coverage depth in millimeters. So if I multiply 0.19 by 100, I have 19. So it means that I have 19 millimeters of water in this 10 centimeter of soil. And for the entire depth, it means I have 183 millimeters of water in the entire 120 centimeter depth of soil. And finally, if I want to convert this to inches, again, converting 19 millimeters to inches, it means I have just slightly less than 3/4 of an inch at that top 10 centimeter depth. And for the entire profile, I have 7.2 inches in the entire 4 feet of soil. So this is how to, again, convert from volumetric water content to the inch or to the millimeter of water. Now, something to note though is that you'll notice that despite the fact that the volumetric water content at this depth were actually much lower than at the surface, because the coverage depth is higher, they actually do contribute disproportionately to the entire depth. So that's why if you look at the map and it's showing the entire depth and it's showing optimum or wet, but you're looking at the surface and you're thinking, well, this surface looks so dry, how can it show wet? That's because you do have a disproportionate contribution from the moisture content at depth because of the increase or the large coverage depth. And so I'm just going to quickly preview, there was a study done in 2004 by Alice Church, and it was presented at the Manitoba Soil Science meeting. And I think Alice Church collected a lot of samples across Agro-Manitoba and came up with this classification of, the textural classification, the permanent wilting point, field capacity, and available water. And I presented the information both in millimeters as well as in inches per 4 feet of soil. The trian that we just looked at 183, it was about 7.2 inches. The trian is actually a loamy sand location. So the permanent wilting point would be around, I would say about 90 millimeters, thereabout. And so that means that with the 183 millimeters of water that is there, or the 7.2 inches, right off the bat, about 3 inches would not be available to plant at all, because that's the permanent wilting point. The field capacity for a loamy sand would be around that 280, 300, about 280. And that means that at that point, which is 280 or 300 is about 12 inches. So at about 12 inches, the current moisture at that 4 feet is 7.2. It means that it is well below field capacity. And if the water goes down slightly more, it would actually get down to the dry region. And then once it gets to permanent wilting point, it's the very dry region. So again, this gives you an idea of what you have to work with in terms of the moisture content at a specific location in relation to the texture. And I'm going to turn it over to Alison to look at the various soil moisture information that we provide.
Thanks, Timmy. I'm just gonna get my screen up and running here. Hopefully.
Okay, so it's not coming up. Hey, Allison? Do you see it on your other screen?
It's not coming up on, I don't see it on any screen yet. It's thinking.
No, that's good. There, if you could click on that one, or you can close that for sure, and then choose the other one.
I'm just gonna restart, hopefully. Oh, not good for a minute. I apologize for the delay.
It's okay. Yeah, PowerPoint can do this. Maybe we could go back to Timmy, or is this?
No, you can probably go back to Timmy, and then I think that'll work. Yeah.
Okay, and then once you're ready, just kind of pop in and we'll let you know. We'll bring you back in.
Yeah, thanks.
You're welcome.
Okay, yeah, hopefully that works, Alison, later. But yeah, I'm gonna just keep continuing here. Can you see my screen okay?
You bet.
Okay, so we've listed some 4 common questions that we get with regards to soil moisture and the information we provide. Alison was going to show some of the information we provide. Hopefully we can get back to that later. But one of the questions we get is that it rained, but the sensor did not respond to precipitation. And I would say, yes, that can happen. Sometimes it do happen. However, one, it depends on how much precipitation that you receive. Oftentimes, if it's maybe less than half an inch, less than 10 millimeters or 12 millimeters, sometimes you actually may not see any response. This was actually a screenshot I got yesterday at one of the stations. This was at Trian, and the precipitation of about 8 millimeters, just about a third of an inch, that we received at the location received on May 2nd, actually did cause an increase at the 5 centimeters. But you'd notice that at 20 centimeters, there was almost nothing, no effect at all at 20 centimeters. So it did impact the surface, but no impact at 20 centimeters. Now, sometimes you should also note that the information we provide on this is based on the average soil moisture recorded for that day. So what it does is our moisture is actually recorded every 15 minutes. So that means that for an entire day, you would have about 96 values, which would be averaged for the day. So if the precipitation occurred late during the day, so let's say precipitation occurred around 6, 7 p.m., you may actually not see any impact as such, because throughout the day, for from midnight up until 6 or 7 p.m., it's been entirely really dry, and then you have just a little bump later in the day. The average may still be really low as well. So that's actually what happened here at this location at Winkler. This was the data at Winkler for the exact same day. May 2nd, Winkler got about 5 millimeters. About a fifth of an inch. But then at this 5 centimeters, it actually did not make any difference at all. In fact, the precipitation actually kept going down, and that's because the precipitation occurred very late in the day, and when it takes the aggregate or it takes the average, it actually did not make any difference compared to the previous day. So that's some of the reasons. And again, sometimes it also depends on the antecedent dryness. If things have been really dry, like this location that has a bit of a crack at the surface, again, this is often common in clay when you have cracks, it can actually create what we call preferential flow, such that if my sensor is installed right here where there is no crack at all, and it rains, I'm still going to sense, like the sensor will still maybe get a bit of rain, but not as much as you would have expected, because most of the rain pretty much maybe is going down the cracks in preferential flow. So those are some of the reasons. However, I should say usually when you have at least an inch, about over half an inch of rain, we do expect that there should be a response. Another question that we do get is that my field is dry, but your map shows that my area is optimal. What's happening? And one of the things I always like to remind folks is that the map we produce is not intended to represent field scale information. I showed that the sensor we use only measures about 3 inches. So it does not even, and again, we try to make sure that during installation that we install the station in a representative location, but we know that soil is very heterogeneous. So there is really no way that we will be able to represent what's happening at a field scale. So the map we produce, and we always mention it, that it's for regional soil moisture. It's just to get a perspective of how things are on a generic scale. It's never meant for a field specific information. And we also do recognize that there is also great bias from interpolation between points. So interpolation is simply saying, if I am in Winnipeg and my moisture is wet, and I am in Brandon and my moisture is dry, then somewhere between Winnipeg and Brandon, so let's say Port La Prairie, then I should be midway between wet and dry. Now, we know that in reality, that doesn't happen. So there are biases from interpolating between points. And I have some points about that, but I'm going to skip those. And the third aspect is also to note that there is also depth bias, and I showed it earlier on that we do have greater contribution from sensors installed at depth. So sometimes, again, because most folks are looking at the surface can look very dry, but the surface is only contributing less than 75% of the total soil volume. So sometimes the surface can be dry, and even at this is showing 0 to 30 centimeters. But the 0 to 30 centimeters is a combination of the information at 5 centimeters, which represents 0 to 10, and then the one installed at 20 centimeters, which represents the 11 to 30 centimeters. So by virtue of the way it's set up, the 11 to 30 centimeter would actually have more contribution than the 0 to 10 centimeters because it has a greater depth coverage. So sometimes, and that is actually what we see happening right now. I've actually had someone emailed that, well, your map keeps showing that things are optimum when we know the surface is very dry. Yes, we agree the surface is dry. And something that Alison and I discussed that, we may actually, maybe especially around this time of the year, start producing the data or the map that shows only the top 5 centimeters, which if we do that, I'm sure you'd actually see way more red than what you are seeing right now. It's actually going to be mostly dry and very dry range if you're looking at just that 5 centimeters. Another question we do get is that why are other maps showing different soil moisture levels than the one your map is showing? And what I did was to present our map on May 2nd, that was last week, Monday. And this map, and this is a great resource to use as well for those that are not familiar with it. The federal government through AAFC, which is Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, they published these maps. And this was for May 3rd, ours for May 2nd. They publish it weekly as well. And it's actually showing all red. So why is ours showing the optimum and then this is showing all red? And something to know, and it's always good to understand how the maps are made and what information they provide before making comparison. So I'm going to point maybe just 3 quick differences in these two maps. And the first thing is that our map, like I said, shows 0 to 30 centimeters. The AAFC maps shows 0 to 5 centimeters, actually less than 5 centimeters. It only look at less than the top 2 inches. So right there, the difference in depth coverage is actually enough to, again, create the difference, because right now the surface is involved in, again, the evapotranspiration or evaporation, because we don't have much transpiration happening. The crops are not established right now. So the surface is very close to, again, the environmental and atmospheric heating and cooling. So that's why the surface is much drier. However, I was actually at La Salle, a field just south, west of Brady Road yesterday, and the producer was seeding soybean. And you can actually see the surface, and I think one of his neighbor was actually rolling his field, and you can see a little bit of dirt moving, some soil movement occurring, because the surface is very dry. However, if you dig just slightly deeper to about 4 or 5 inches, you'd actually see that it's not too bad, at least on that field. So it's always good to understand that, it's like comparing apples to oranges. This is at a greater depth, 0 to 30 centimeters. This is only at less than 5 centimeters at the surface. And the second thing to note as well is that what we do in terms of our map, it compares what we are seeing on that day to what the saturation level would have been. So saturation is, let's assume the entire pore space is filled with water. What's going to be the saturation? That's what we provide. The AAFC map, what it shows the average over 1 week compared to the 5-year average for that week. So again, it's not comparing it to saturation with the AAFC map, it's comparing it to the 5-year average. And then the final thing to note as well is that the data from the data used to generate these maps, we use data from sensors that are buried in the field. And like I said, the sensors are only about 3-inch long, about just a little more than 2 inches in terms of the volume. AFC uses satellite data. Now with satellite data, it's really great because it gives you what is happening right at the surface. However, the small satellite that they use, it's the Soil Moisture Oceanography, Ocean and Salinity. It's a European Space Agency satellite. The satellite provides data at gridded resolution, and the gridded resolution is actually at about, I think I said, 25 degrees. So 25 degrees is roughly 30 kilometers. So it means that they are using 1 data point for every 30 kilometers on the ground. So again, the argument can be made, how can you have 1 data point to represent such a large area? I think their map as well isn't meant to be used for field-specific information. So it's always good to understand the differences in this map before trying to make a comparison. The final question that I would quickly just raise is that in a dry year, we've had that crops did not appear to be stressed. Why did that happen? And again, this actually just shows the image of sometimes, although we are used to rainfall and soil being wetted from the surface, but sometimes we actually do have capillary movement occurring from the groundwater, as shown in this picture. And I've shown at Oak Lake, just around the Souris area, how we've had the groundwater pattern over the last 50 years or so. And again, in the last 10 years, we're actually been in the wet end of things, but we seem to be going down now slightly a little bit. So those will be the information that I have in terms of, again, sometimes the plant may not appear stressed, and that's because it may actually be getting some capillary movement from groundwater if it's close enough to the root zone. So basically, again, we would want to hear from you, from the audience today, in terms of how do you use soil moisture information, and what is the best way to present the information in a way that makes it easier for you to interpret. Hopefully Alison is able to get the things going. Alison?
Yeah, she is back. I'll just give her 1 second here I've just moved her back over and she thinks she's ready to go.
Okay.
Okay, we're gonna try this again, Allison.
All right.
Looks good. If you want to just swap, good.
All right.
Okay, we're good.
Okay. Thanks. Sorry about that. So I'm just going to, now that I have a better understanding of how to interpret some of the soil moisture information, I'm just going to quickly go over how the public can view some of this information at their own leisure. So we have 4 tools for viewing soil moisture through the government website. And this is the current weather viewer, and it can be accessed using the link at the top of the page. And this is a dynamic map that shows the current conditions. It's updated every hour. Oops, I'm going too fast. It's going updates every hour. And by clicking on these 3 little menu bars here, you can select soil moisture. And it will show you the live conditions for that page. So there we go. And we have the soil moisture displayed at, you can select the 5 centimeters, 20 centimeters, 50 centimeters, or 100 centimeter depth. And this is all the volumetric moisture content, which Timmy mentioned is the volume of water in relation to the volume of soil at a given depth at that particular site. To view more information or more detailed information on any station, you simply click on one of the dots and select more info, and that will bring you to our live conditions page. So this page updates every 15 minutes during the growing season. I believe the soil moisture information updates every hour. And this is in addition to the basic weather data. So we have our precipitation, temperature, humidity, wind speed, all the basic weather information. We also have 3 areas on this map that show soil moisture. So the first one is the soil moisture in percentage of volumetric water content. Again, that is updated hourly. The second is we have a graph. So this shows the average volumetric moisture content at each depth over the past 14 days. This is updated hourly as well. And we have had requests in the past or suggestions to add wilting point or the field capacity or the field capacity as a reference to this graph. However, we have to keep in mind that we would have to add those 2 references for each soil depth. So that would be an additional 8 lines. And at that point, it would be pretty congested on that graph. So due to the web capacity limitations and our space limitations, we haven't added that yet, but we are always kind of looking into ways that we can better display the information. And the final location on this map where you can view soil moisture information is at the bottom of the page where we have yesterday's summary. This is the average soil volumetric water content at each depth for the past day up until midnight. The second location where you can view soil moisture information is the maps that we publish to our website on Mondays each week during the growing season. Please note that even though we publish them on a weekly basis, the information displayed is the maximum volumetric moisture content from the previous day only. It's not a summary of the weekly conditions. So for example, this map here is showing the conditions of the maximum volumetric water content at these stations on May 9th. We publish one map for the 0 to 30 centimeters and one subsurface map for the 0 to 120 centimeter depths. And Timmy already kind of gave us a really good summary on why sometimes these maps may look a little different than expected. And it's a lot due to the variation of soil over very small distances. Soil texture and other soil characteristics play a huge role in how it is displayed over distances and how it is displayed at each site, as well as the differences in depths. So the link for these maps are at the bottom of the page. You can also subscribe to receive our crop weather reports and maps via email. And again, just to remind you that this is relative to saturation. So the information displayed on these maps is different than the information that we just saw on the live weather page, whereas that's the basic volumetric water content for that soil. In order to make it uniform for the entire map, we use the volumetric moisture content relative to the saturation point. So for example, if we have a clay site with a saturation point of 50% and a sandy site with a saturation point of 30%, if they're both reporting volumetric moisture contents of 25%, the sandy soil would be, excuse me, the sandy soil would be around 83%, indicating it would be wet. Whereas at 25%, the clay soil would be more in the optimal range at 20, or dry range at 25%. The final tool we have for displaying soil moisture is our fall soil moisture maps. So each year around freeze up, we publish maps to illustrate the amount of moisture at freeze up as an indication of the water that may be available in the spring. We create maps showing the available soil moisture at freeze up, which is the amount of water in millimeters that the soil has on a given date that would be available for plant growth, i.e. the point between the permanent wilting point and field capacity. We create maps for the 0 to 30 centimeter depth, the 0 to 20 centimeter depth, and the 30 to 20 centimeter depth. And we also convert these soil moisture readings into the percent available water holding capacity. So basically it's similar information, just converted to a percentage. And again, while this is an indication of what the soil moisture conditions are at freeze up, there are many other factors that can impact the amount of soil that will actually, or sorry, the amount of water that will actually be available to the plants in spring. So that's a quick summary on our end on how to access the tools. Again, if you have any questions about the links or the tools themselves, please forward any questions on to us.
Okay, thanks, Timmy and Allison. That was some good information on the soil map reading. And one comment I always get is if it could be somehow reported in millimeters or just to make it a little bit easier to understand. And I think, I don't know if you guys are working on something like that or not.
Yeah, we're working on something like that. Actually, we had tried to change a few things, but I think right now we have some limitation IT related. So hopefully we can get some of our IT folks on board with being able to help us make some of the changes we want to make. But yeah, no, it's something that we've definitely thought about and we'll be looking at implementing.
Okay, good. Well, thanks, guys. You're going to hang on in case we have some questions here as we go through. But I'm going to get to our crop scouting panel. I have a few questions I want to get answered today before we leave. And one of the ones that's been coming in quite a bit lately is dry conditions and no rain in the forecast. When should I start looking at reducing my phosphate with seed as to not to damage germination? And I gave this one out to John and Marla, and I think Marla is going to take a stab at this one. And I think she has a couple of slides too, so if we could turn the screen over to her.
Excellent. Okay, John put a couple of slides together. Hopefully you can see them.
You bet.
Okay, and I just wanted to kind of show what he had put together, just to highlight a couple of questions here coming in regarding this seed place fertilizer issue. And so what John always wants to do is make sure that people are taking a look at whatever resources we do have access to. So one of the main resources that we use in this case is the Seed Place Fertilizer Decision Guide. If anyone is looking for this, the website here is across the top of the screen, but you can also just go in and Google Seed Place Fertilizer IPNI or Seed Place Fertilizer SDSU for South Dakota State University, since they're the ones that put this together, and it'll be the first thing that comes up. So in here, you can actually fill in all the information you're looking for based on which type you're seeding, based on the fertilizer you're applying, and then you can end up adding in values in terms of what your SBU is for the decision tool here. So you're basically filling in anything that's in kind of the blue or the some of the blue boxes here. So you have fine, medium, or coarse textured soil, and then you can actually choose what your soil moisture is. So as an example that John had put in, just to be able to see this a little bit better, this was canola, putting down map with canola, 10-inch spacing, 1-inch seed furrow opening with a 10% tolerable stand loss. That's one of the other things that you can do when you're filling this in, is it says down here, how much stand are you actually willing to lose? Because there's going to be some loss, so they put that tolerance level in. This was a coarse or sandy soil that he had filled in. And when the moisture, or when the soil was listed as being moist, it came back with an 11 pound of phosphate per acre application rate. But when it was dry, it cuts it in half. So really, when we're looking at something like this, a case with canola, putting down that phosphate, you're dealing with dry conditions, you're cutting that application rate in half. Again, if you were dealing with a fine to medium soil, clay or clay loam soil type, again, cuts it in half if that condition is dry. So we do need to be really cautious right now when we're dealing with phosphate fertilizer. There's some additional information here around seed place fertilizer concerns for canola, and it's something that is posted again on the government website around the seed place fertilizer. So when we're dealing with the dry conditions, be a bit more cautious with that phosphate fertilizer application, because the tolerance level is going to be much lower, and you're essentially cutting everything in half in order to maintain that same potential stand loss. Otherwise, you're going to be seeing more loss. So that's what I've got on that topic.
Okay, so just to follow up, if I can't put it down with the seed, what are my options for later on, or do I have many options?
Well, for phosphorus, you don't really have a whole lot of options to be able to try to get it down kind of later, because really the purpose of getting it down and having it close to the seed in the spring is to get that uptake in those first 3 weeks, and the crop is usually looking for it. As long as, I mean, in the long run, you want to make sure that you are maintaining good soil phosphorus levels. And when your phosphorus fertilizer isn't too expensive, that you are putting enough down and kind of building your soil phosphorus to that medium to high level. You want to be in that 10 to 15 parts per million range in your soil test. And so that's one of the key things you want to deal with. I think that in a case like this, when we're dealing with dry conditions, the risk in my mind of frying your canola by putting too much down is a lot higher than being a bit short on your starter fertilizer. So recognize that we might see some phosphorus kind of shortages in that early growth, and might see a bit of phosphorus deficiency, but hopefully that crop is going to kind of grow through it and keep going, because we don't really have a lot of phosphorus rescue application later on. Because of the fact that, again, we're putting it close to the seed so that that young seedling can find it in that first 3 weeks of growth when it's really looking for it.
Okay, great. Thanks, Marla. Flora, you can give the screen back. Okay, next question. I'm going to go to John had sent me those slides as well. This is to Kim Brown. With conditions we've been having, would it make sense to add ammonium sulfate to my burn off? Have the weeds hardened off with these cold and warm conditions that I'm going to need something extra in my tank to get better control?
Yeah, thanks, Lionel. That's a good question, and we do get that question a lot on AMS. And technically, you don't need AMS unless you've got hard water, either through calcium and magnesium ions in the water, or higher levels of bicarbonate. So, and glyphosate is something that is particularly sensitive to hard water. In fact, in the guide, in the glyphosate pages, in the effects of growing conditions, there's actually a statement in there talking about hard water. So if you haven't got a water test and you don't know, then really it's a chemistry thing. It helps. It doesn't make the glyphosate really any hotter if there's nothing wrong with the water in the first place, or if you don't have high levels of those ions, the calcium and magnesium. But having said that, you can throw in some ammonium sulfate. It does enhance the use of glyphosate in the cases where there is ions in the water, but there really isn't any evidence that says that it actually makes glyphosate work better when your water's good and in the absence, to make everything a little bit hotter. Other products in crop, that's something we can come back to maybe at a later date, but there are some products in crop that do recommend adding AMS to overcome some antagonism. That's a different case again. But yeah, for glyphosate, like I said, if you don't have a water test and you don't know, you really don't know whether the AMS is going to help you or not. But for sure, if you're suspecting that the glyphosate hasn't been working well, or there's issues where it hasn't worked well simply because of the quality of the water, which is, again, mostly your calcium and magnesium ions, but it could be your bicarbonate levels as well. So a water test will show you that. And then, of course, with glyphosate, you have to have clean water, no dirt, or it can't be turbid water, nothing suspended in it. It's got to be from a clean water source. And usually we're pulling from good water sources, so we're okay on that end. But those are the two things with glyphosate to help it work better in the spring.
Okay, thanks, Kim. I guess in the essence of time, I'm going to skip a few of the questions and we can come back to them later. Some of them were meant for a little bit later anyways. A few slides here just to let you know about the crop guide, where to get a hold of it, and our 1-800 number if you're looking for more information regarding where to get these books. Our ag adaptation specialists, there's 7 of us in the province, and our contact information, so feel free to contact us anytime. And that's it. We'll have the questions that we didn't get to this week on next week and join us next week, May the 19th, as we'll be getting close to, if weather conditions stay the same, we'll be getting close to being done seeding, I think, because I think it's going to be a canola week next week. So thanks for joining and see you next week.